The War of 1812 was a multifaceted conflict fought between the young United States and the British Empire, along with their Canadian colonies and Indigenous allies. Usually referred as a Second War of Independence, it reflects the United States' struggle to defend its rights as a neutral nation during the Napoleonic Wars raging between Britain and France. Amid this conflict, American merchants found themselves in the crossfire as Britain's Royal Navy blockaded Europe and forcibly conscripted thousands of U.S. sailors into British service, while French decrees also threatened neutral ships. President James Madison and his administration viewed the harassment of American shipping and the kidnapping of American seamen not only as a direct affront to U.S. sovereignty, but also as a challenge to the nation's claim to equal standing among nations. They feared that allowing such practices to continue would risk America being treated as a British colony once again. By defending its neutrality, the United States asserted its right to exist. However, the American struggle for recognition was only part of the story. A faction of war hawks in Congress, representing southern and western states, hungered for territorial expansion. It was no secret in London that former President Thomas Jefferson had coveted Canada, and Spanish-held Florida was seen as an equally tempting prize. Believing that war with Britain could fulfill a long-standing vision of a continent under U.S. control, American politicians helped pave the way for conflict. The nation was deeply divided. New England Federalists, dependent on British trade, opposed war, while Southerners and Westerners, frustrated by British trade restrictions and frontier clashes, supported it. After months of deliberation, President Madison concluded that war was inevitable, and Congress formally declared it on June 18, 1812, the first official war declaration in U.S. history. Ironically, Britain had repealed its controversial trade restrictions just 2 days earlier, but slow transatlantic communication delayed the news. Still, unresolved tensions, such as British impressment of American sailors and support for indigenous resistance, made war likely regardless. Many Americans believed that conquering Canada would be easy. In reality, the invasion of Canada proved to be a fiasco. In the summer of 1812, U.S. General William Hull led an army into Upper Canada, modern Ontario, only to retreat and ignominiously surrender Detroit to a smaller British-Canadian force without firing a shot. Hull's men were intimidated by British General Isaac Brock and his ally, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who cleverly exaggerated their troop strength. The loss of Detroit stunned the nation, and for a while the U.S. even lost control of Michigan Territory. Simultaneously, another American thrust across the Niagara River was repelled at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October 1812. Though Brock was killed in that battle, the Canadians, including militia and Mohawk warriors, forced the surrender of U.S. forces, foiling the invasion. One arena where the United States found surprising success was at sea. In August 1812, the USS Constitution dueled and defeated HMS Guerriere, tearing the British ship to pieces. Other American frigates like the USS United States and the USS Constitution again, versus HMS Java, scored wins in 1812. These encounters had little strategic impact. Britain's navy had hundreds of ships, but they proved that American sailors and officers could hold their own. Despite these cheery moments, Britain soon imposed a tight blockade on American ports, strangling maritime trade. New England in particular felt the economic pain and grew more vocal in opposing the war. Meanwhile, the war on land in 1813 continued to seesaw. American forces made a second attempt to invade Canada along the Niagara frontier and the Lake Ontario corridor. They had mixed success. U.S. troops burned York, now Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada, in April 1813, capturing and destroying government buildings. In September, American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry also won a crucial naval battle on Lake Erie. Perry's victory forced the British to abandon Detroit, which U.S. General William Henry Harrison retook. Harrison's army then defeated the retreating British and their Indigenous allies at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, in October 1813. In that battle, Tecumseh, the charismatic Shawnee leader and key British ally, was killed, shattering the Indigenous confederation he had built and blowing Native American hopes of stopping U.S. westward expansion. Still, by the close of 1813, the war had proven largely disastrous for the United States on other fronts. The American invasions of Canada had failed to conquer any territory of significance. In fact, the British had gone on the offensive along the frontiers. They seized forts at Mackinac Island and Prairie du Chien, securing the upper Great Lakes and parts of the Mississippi Valley. Off the New England coast, British raids became frequent, and a slice of eastern Maine was occupied by British troops in late 1814. With each side unable to land a knockout blow, the conflict settled into a grim war of attrition. The year 1814 proved decisive. In Europe, Napoleon's empire collapsed in the spring, allowing Britain to redirect seasoned troops to the American theater. The British government, furious at what it saw as an opportunistic American betrayal during Britain's life-and-death struggle with France, decided to hit back hard. They launched a three-pronged offensive against the United States, from Canada into New York, through the Chesapeake Bay to strike the U.S. capital, and via the Gulf of Mexico to menace New Orleans. American forces braced for the onslaught on all fronts. In August 1814, a British expeditionary force led by General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn sailed into Chesapeake Bay, with the intention to punish the Yankees for invading Canada and burning York. President Madison had foolishly left the capital's defense to a disorganized militia. On August 24, 1814, at the Battle of Bladensburg just outside Washington, Ross's battle-hardened redcoats routed the American militia in a panic so swift it was derisively nicknamed the Bladensburg Races. The road to Washington, D.C. lay wide open. That night, British troops entered Washington and set fire to the U.S. Capitol, destroying its chamber and thousands of books in the Library of Congress. They also burned the White House, exacting revenge for the earlier American burning of York, now Toronto. In a famous anecdote, First Lady Dolly Madison refused to flee until she had secured a full-length portrait of George Washington. The flames that engulfed Washington presented a humiliating sight for Americans. However, the very next day, a sudden and massive thunderstorm, possibly a hurricane, swept through the city, extinguishing the fires and forcing the British to cut short their occupation. On August 25, General Ross deemed the damage sufficient and withdrew his forces from the ruined capital. Meanwhile, the northern prong came in early September 1814, when a British army of 10,000 under General Sir George Prevost advanced into upstate New York, aiming to cut off New England. This thrust bogged down at Plattsburgh, on the shores of Lake Champlain. There, on September 11, 1814, a smaller U.S. naval squadron under Master Commandant Thomas Macdonough achieved a stunning victory, defeating the British fleet and prompting General Prevost to retreat back to Canada. This victory saved New York from invasion and gave Americans a much-needed boost after the burning of Washington. This also influenced ongoing peace negotiations by making the British more willing to settle. A day later, Ross's troops landed on Baltimore. However, unlike Washington, the city defenders had prepared extensive earthworks and fortifications under Major General Samuel Smith. Both British and American militia clashed at the Battle of North Point. In the skirmishing, General Ross, who had confidently vowed to dine in Baltimore that night, was fatally shot by an American sharpshooter. The British advance stalled as Colonel Arthur Brooke took command. 2 days later, British warships attempted to force their way into Baltimore's harbor by bombarding Fort McHenry, which guarded the city's approach. For 25 hours, the British bombarded the fort with rockets and mortar shells, yet Fort McHenry endured with minimal damage. The sight the next morning of a huge American flag still flying defiantly above the fort inspired a young lawyer, Francis Scott Key, to jot down a poem, the Star-Spangled Banner, which would later become the U.S. national anthem. Key, who had witnessed the bombardment from a British ship where he was held, had almost despaired during the night, but, through the morning mist, he saw the stars and stripes still waving. His words, "Oh say can you see," captured the euphoria of that moment. For the British, the failure at Baltimore, coming so soon after the setback at Plattsburgh, was decisive. They abandoned the Chesapeake campaign. Even as diplomats negotiated peace in Europe, one final, epic battle was brewing on the Gulf Coast. The British aimed to seize New Orleans, America's vital Mississippi River port, to control the western frontier or trade it at the negotiating table. In December 1814, a large British force under General Sir Edward Pakenham landed in Louisiana, encountering an American army led by General Andrew Jackson. Jackson, a fiery Tennessee soldier planter, had already earned renown fighting Creek Indians in the South and was known for his uncompromising will and hatred of the British. Upon arriving in New Orleans, Jackson declared martial law and rallied an unlikely collection of defenders. He enlisted a truly eclectic group of Americans, frontiersmen, local militia, former slaves, native allies, mainly from the Choctaw Nation, and pirates, notably Jean Lafitte and his Barataria buccaneers. On the foggy morning of January 8, 1815, the British launched a full-scale assault on Jackson's earthwork fortifications at Chalmette, just outside New Orleans. The result was a lopsided disaster for the British. In just about 30 minutes of ferocious fighting, the British suffered roughly 2,000 casualties, whereas American losses were around 250. General Pakenham was mortally wounded. Ironically, the Battle of New Orleans need not have been fought at all. The peace treaty ending the war had been signed in Europe 2 weeks earlier, on December 24, 1814. However, the combatants in Louisiana were unaware of this. The Treaty of Ghent essentially restored the status quo ante bellum, no territory changed hands, and contentious issues like maritime rights and impressment were left unaddressed. Nonetheless, Britain's defeat at New Orleans provided Americans with the psychological victory they had long desired. The British last attempt to regain a foothold in America had failed decisively. From that day forward, the United States would steadily ascend on the world stage, while Britain turned its attention elsewhere. When news of the peace finally reached America in February 1815, accompanied by word of the victory at New Orleans, massive celebrations erupted. Politically, the war elevated new national heroes such as Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, both of whom would later be elected president on the strength of their wartime fame. Strategically, Britain's withdrawal from the Northwest Territory left native peoples east of the Mississippi without a foreign ally capable of countering American expansion. In the decade following 1815, American settlers surged westward. In 1819, the United States acquired Florida from Spain, and by 1823, the Monroe Doctrine boldly warned European powers to steer clear of the Western Hemisphere. One of the war's most immediate political casualties was the Federalist Party, America's first political party, whose anti-war stance came to be seen as unpatriotic, even treasonous. With the Federalists effectively dissolved by 1816, the so-called era of good feelings emerged, a period marked by one-party rule under the Democratic Republicans and a, perhaps superficial, sense of national harmony. Partisan rancor cooled notably in the post-war years, giving way to a new nationalist consensus. An often overlooked aspect of the war was its African American dimension. The British offered freedom to enslaved African Americans who fled their American masters and fought for King George. Hundreds accepted the offer, serving in British military units such as the Colonial Marines. After the war, many were resettled in Nova Scotia and Trinidad, forging new lives far from the conflict's original battlegrounds. Thanks for joining us for this deeper dive into the causes, conflicts, and consequences of the War of 1812. If you enjoyed this exploration of a pivotal moment in American history, be sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell to stay updated on future episodes. See you next time.